The World Economic Forum on Africa concluded today. Nompumelelo Siziba and Francis Hurd were there for the duration of the three-day gathering, and we cross now to Cape Town to find out the developments of the day.
Well, thanks very much, Gunter. Yes, we've been here for 3 days and it's been very interesting here in the chilly Cape Town weather. But the mood here at the Cape Town Convention Centre is not chilly. It's a very warm feeling. People are very optimistic about the future of Africa. And there was a lot of discussion about the challenges facing the continent, including your energy, skills that are needed, development, etc., etc. But there's a feeling that there are lots of solutions out there which can be concretized for the betterment of the continent. Now, Francis, I understand that you attended the Africa Progress Report. Gracia Marcel was speaking there. Tell us about that.
Yes, so like you say, energy front and center, especially today. Gracia Marcel, part of this panel set up by Kofi Annan from the UN. And every year at the World Economic Forum meetings on Africa, they present a report. This year's called Power, People, Planet. And it starts with the problem of power in South Africa. And the numbers are just staggering. Gracia Marcel said they're horrible. And they are. Out of about 1 billion people in Africa, 600 million or so do not have access to electricity. Now that means 2/3. So in a sense, Africa is still this dark continent. But what the panelists were talking about was the opportunity that exists here. We can jump over, ignore those policies of the past that led to dirty energy and go straight to the clean, renewable energy, things like that. So then, of course, it's how do we harness technology, but the costs have come down, and the panelists saying really that this is an opportunity to be grasped. Of course, all this talk about energy, as you know, has put the spotlight on South Africa a little bit.
Well, indeed it has, because obviously South Africa does have its own challenges. We've been experiencing load shedding, but the chairman or the acting chairperson at Eskom was earlier saying today that it's unlikely that we're going to experience load shedding at least until the next of the year. So now, earlier we had Gordon Brown, the former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, saying that he thinks that actually the challenges on the African continent are not as bad as people think. He thinks that there's lots of money out there to fund infrastructure, and he says that there's political will to actually get these projects going.
So infrastructure is something that we all agree on. There are two things I think you'll agree with me that have come out of here. We need more regional integration, and East Africa has been hailed as this beautiful light. A lot of integration happening there, but the challenge still to integrate the three regions. And infrastructure, the building of roads, bridges, the building of airports, all of those things are crucial to encourage the free movement of goods and services, as well as people across the African continent. Now, infrastructure in the spotlight, but where does the money come from? So a lot of talk of capital markets in Africa. How do we deepen those? How do we get finance for this huge infrastructure deficit that needs to be addressed? Let's take a look at what came out.
It's been 3 days of intense economic deliberations here at the World Economic Forum. Discussions ranged from entrepreneurship, investment opportunities, and even how Africa can enhance its debt capital markets. It's estimated that Africa needs to spend at least 12 trillion rands a year on improving infrastructure, from power supply to roads, railway and ports. Currently, as much as 30 African countries, including South Africa, experience regular power cuts. Almost all the money needed for infrastructure spending is borrowed from overseas financial institutions. That's because Africa does not have its own capital markets. Delegates attending the World Economic Forum say that needs to change.
What is coming out clearly is that Africa does have savings, but we do not have a capital market that would channel those savings from the savers to the borrowers. In the main, how do we develop African capital markets and make sure that they are able to fund Africa's infrastructure needs.
While the continent has seen a rapid growth in cell phone communications over the past decade and a half, internet access is still lagging far behind the rest of the world. This hampers economic growth and Africa's integration into the world economy. But some say progress is being made in improving digital migration on the continent.
You see Kenya being the hub of the ICT hub for Africa. The bandwidth speeds certainly in East and West Africa have increased. So I think that the migration is happening, maybe not as fast as we would like, but certainly the increase of bandwidth through the fiber optic cables has increased the amount of access.
The forum concludes with a better insight of what Africa's vision is, and although there are hurdles along the way, the continent continues to strive for a better future every year. Diabo Seto, SABC News, Cape Town.
Well, a very hot topic here at the World Economic Forum has obviously been around corruption and maladministration and wastage that has cost the continent billions and billions of dollars. But not only corruption within the continent, but corruption from sources outside of the continent, with multinationals and other corporates, flushing out cash out of the African continent and it not staying in the continent to actually fund development. Those are the sorts of issues that were being discussed. Our very own President, Jacob Zuma, was talking about how it's important for leaders not to hold on to power and seek terms longer than their constitutions actually permit. So these are some of the issues that were being spoken about, and we have a little insert that tells us about that. Let's take a look.
Focusing on key impediments to African growth, a lack of integrity by financial institutions, and an unclear legal and policy frameworks, obstacles role players acknowledge they have to overcome.
We have a huge obligation to make sure that that the financial services functions in an ethical manner, but also provides inclusivity, provides opportunities for broader involvement of as many of our people as possible.
Corruption topping the agenda.
Corruption needs to be eradicated in Africa, and this is key. If you're talking about the financial sector, if there is any element, if there is any even perception of corruption, it's not going to work, it's not going to be sustainable.
The leaders of economies also believe international cooperation could prevent tax evasion and the illicit transfer of capital across the borders.
Delegates here believe that Africa continues to grow at a moderate rate despite weaker global growth, but challenges remain high rates of unemployment and poverty. Manelisi Tubase, SABC News, Cape Town.
So, like Nompu said earlier, there's a lot of optimism around this continent coming out of these meetings, but also concerns about the challenges, about stagnating competition, for instance. Will we see the growth rates that we've seen in the past? And the question is, are meetings like this a talk shop where people just spew platitudes? Or can something really firm and substantial come out of these meetings? And you got the take earlier of the World Economic Forum's head of Africa, Elsie Kanza, a dynamic woman.
Yes, a very dynamic woman indeed. And I did have an interview with her earlier, and she was saying, no, this is not a talk shop. They recorded the highest attendance at the WEF for Africa since it began 25 years ago. And she says what's actually happening is that they're having talks which are translating into concrete projects, and she even itemized them.
And she's been credited for raising the tone, for really giving gravitas to what's happening and the WEF's involvement behind it. Let's take a look at what she had to say earlier.
It's the final day of WEF Africa, but there's a feeling that there was very limited African government representation, because obviously people had to make a choice as to whether they attend WEF Africa or the AU summit next week. What's your perception?
Well, my perception or the reality really is that we had strong government participation at the ministerial level, and also some heads of government present. as well as heads of regional organizations such as the African Union Commission. The deputy chair was here with at least 3 commissioners, heads of international organizations, CFO, as well as the head of Africa at the World Bank, the head of MIGA, overall over 90 present, with the heads of state. As you may appreciate, they cannot relocate to South Africa for a week, and the African Union Summit is taking place next week, and that's actually an obligation on their part.
Righty-ho. Now, that's obviously positive in your view. Do you think that there's been a meeting of minds between the private sector, all the global players who've come from around the world and locally, and these African governments around how best to go forward with development on the continent?
Well, what's been incredible to see is hearing people who have been coming to the World Economic Forum on Africa for 24 years out of the past 25 years. And even with you businesses saying, this is my 3rd meeting that I'm attending in a row. So they're clearly committed to the nature of engagement that takes place during the meeting, but more importantly, the outcomes. So if you take, for example, our agricultural initiative, the Grow Africa. This kicked off in Cape Town in 2011. It's a collaboration between the Forum, the African Union Commission and the NEPAD agency, essentially working with the private sector, both from the continent as well as outside the continent, to see how to accelerate investment into that sector that also brings about a transformation of smallholder farmers. So just in 3 years, we've received over $10 billion committed. We've had that translated into actual investments that have transformed tens of thousands of farmers already. And we had the Grow Africa Investment Forum here. We started with the first one in Addis in 2012. And there you have actual countries able to pitch their projects as well as investors able to pitch their projects. So you see that there's a very close bonding in terms of cooperating to move the agriculture transformation agenda forward. So that's just one example. We also have an infrastructure initiative, again, that's linked to a continental initiative in collaboration with the African Union Commission, the NEPAD agency and the African Development Bank, where we've been looking to see how to make progress on the PIDA. So PIDA program, the Program for Infrastructure Development in Africa. And this is basically a set of 51 transnational projects that political leaders have committed to and said these are our priorities. And since Addis, since 2012, we've been working again with the private sector to say, well, how do we translate this pledge into actual reality? And over the last 3 years, we've been able to move from 51 programs on paper to a pilot, which is the Central Corridor, which is Eastern Central Africa. It's across 5 governments. And over the last 12 months, we've actually been able to get to the point of having 23 shortlisted projects out of initial over 100 amongst the 5 governments. And out of those, to actually have a short list that are ready for bankability, and we've actually already had sessions with the private sector to say, how do you invest in this project? So you can see we have actual examples of how we move from dialogue and ideas to action, and this is what people are committed to. And as you may be aware, we actually have the highest ever participation by international business this year. And this, despite some of the negative press that you hear about, just goes to show how much commitment there is, 1, to the continent, and then 2, to this model of cooperation that brings together different stakeholders, and 3, that you truly have a committed community both in the continent and around the world that's committed to see Africa move forward and actually bring about prosperity for all.
And briefly, Elsie, just tell us what next. We know that there's an annual WEF forum on Africa, but what happens in the background in the interim, and also where is the next meeting for Africa?
The next meeting for Africa is still a surprise. You will find out by the end of today. Let's not break it.
But in terms of
the element,
behind
it
the
will
scenes,
move outside of Southern Africa, and this continues the tradition of essentially opening up the continent to the rest of the world. South Africa remains our home, which is why we're back here every other year. In terms of what happens next, it's good to keep in mind that this meeting, I like to describe it as an annual general meeting, right, where our stakeholders, our communities are able to converge together. in between, they tend to do to continue working on their work streams independently. So we will continue to have activities related to infrastructure with that community, to issues related to energy with that community, with health with that community, with our youth communities, gender. So these are just, sort of working out the nuts and bolts and looking at what the outcomes were and how to take that forward. Our next meeting next year, I can assure you, will be very much about taking stock of what's been achieved based on the outcomes from this meeting.
Well, South Africa, or the South African government, put its best foot forward at the World Economic Forum. There were so many ministers that attended this forum, rightly so, since we're the host country, and there was a very positive feeling amongst the South African government. I spoke earlier with the Minister in the Presidency, Jeff Radebe, who says that he believes that this was an absolute success, and even around the issues of xenophobia, he felt that the government was able to really communicate that we are a hospitable country, that we love our fellow Africans, and of course the government is going to be looking at overhauling the migration policies so that it gets the balance right in the country. Now, our very own President Jacob Zuma said that this was an absolute success. Let's take a look at what he had to say.
We'll have a very good report to make to the summit, because there are a number of things we need to do as African leaders as well to help meet this enthusiasm that is there from investors with regard to the infrastructure. Because there is a clearer understanding that once we focus on the infrastructure, we are actually creating a very firm platform for business to invest. We are also growing the economy. And therefore it is crucial, because there is no country that can develop economically, without the infrastructure. So we are very happy that it has been given that focus, which raises a number of issues, which helps us to say then to African leaders, these are the matters we need to address. Otherwise, the financiers are ready to come. We need to welcome them with warm hands. Yes, it has been a successful conference. We have handled so well. And I can say to South Africans, well done once again. Everybody left happy that this was one of the best WEF conference indeed. We are very happy. We have achieved something for ourselves as a country and on behalf of Africa as well.
So the drinks are flowing and perhaps enhancing that happiness here at the World Economic Forum in Cape Town, the meetings on Africa. And Desmond Tutu prayed sort of ending the official part of this gathering, and he said that he really hoped that these sort of meetings could be a counterweight to Boko Haram, to the terrorism, to the poverty on the continent, and hopefully something could concrete could come out of these meetings. Just to remind you that all the interviews that we've done are on the website www.sabc.co.za/news, and that is a wrap from us basically.
And next year the WEF for Africa will be held in Rwanda, and the celebrations upstairs involve eating some Rwandan food. But now we are going to bid you farewell. I'm going to try my hand at saying farewell in a Rwandan language. Murakhebo, murakize.
Ciao.